You know, two of Christianity's most central ideas have literally shaped societies for centuries. But what happens when we look at them through the modern lens of psychology and medicine? In this explainer, we're going to dig into a contemporary analysis of their potential impact on our minds and even our bodies.
So let's just dive right in with the big question that frames this whole discussion. Can beliefs that are thousands of years old actually have a tangible, maybe even harmful effect on our well-being today? It's a pretty provocative question for sure, and the analysis we're exploring doesn't pull any punches.
Okay, so to really get the psychological side of things, we first have to understand the theological framework. Now look, for millions of people, these ideas provide incredible comfort, a moral compass, and a path to redemption. Our goal here isn't to question that faith at all, but to explore one specific analysis of how these ideas can also affect mental health. And it's all built around two core concepts: a fundamental problem and its divine solution: original sin and atonement. First up, we have original sin. At its heart, this is the idea that nobody starts with a totally clean slate. Instead, the teaching goes that every single person inherits a flawed, sinful nature right from the moment they're born. The key thing to grasp here is that it's not about something you do. It's about a fundamental state of being that supposedly separates people from God.
And if original sin is the problem, well, atonement is presented as the ultimate solution. This is the belief that Jesus' death was a perfect sacrifice that essentially paid the price for that sin. It's seen as the bridge, the one thing that allows humanity to get back right with God and fix that inherent separation.
All right, so now that we've got the theological basics down, let's shift gears and get to the core of this analysis: the potential psychological toll. How do these really big, abstract beliefs actually translate into concrete, everyday feelings and mental states? And here's the crucial point the source makes. When you're taught from a very young age that you are fundamentally flawed at your core, it can lead to these chronic, deep-seated feelings of guilt, shame, and unworthiness. It's not about feeling bad for something you did wrong, it's about feeling bad for who you are.
This slide really highlights a critical psychological difference. Over on the left, you have healthy guilt, which basically says, I did something bad. It's focused on your behavior, and it can actually motivate you to change for the better. But on the right, you have toxic shame, and that says, I am bad. It's about your core identity. The analysis argues that the doctrine of original sin, if it's not taught with extreme care, runs the risk of fostering this really damaging toxic shame.
And you can imagine, this becomes especially tough for kids. I mean, trying to wrap your head around the idea that you're inherently sinful can be incredibly confusing and honestly pretty frightening. According to the source, this can lead to an intense fear of judgment, major anxiety about being punished, and in some cases, a condition called religious scrupulosity, which is basically a spiritual form of OCD, an unhealthy obsession with being morally perfect.
Now, beyond the individual, the analysis also points to a potential for manipulation. Think about it. When inherent sinfulness is really emphasized, it can become a tool to make people dependent on a religious institution or a specific leader. This can end up discouraging critical thinking and, in the worst cases, be used to enforce control.
This slide kind of shows how it can become a step-by-step process. First, the belief in an inherent flaw is introduced. That can lead to someone internalizing this sense of powerlessness. You know, a feeling of, well, I can't help it, it's just my nature. And the final result can be a loss of self-efficacy, that core belief in your own ability to make good choices and succeed on your own terms.
But the potential impact doesn't just stop with our psychology. The analysis argues that what happens in the mind rarely stays in the mind. It often places a very real burden on the body.
The key idea here is the mind-body connection, which is super well established. Chronic psychological distress, like the constant guilt, shame, and anxiety we've been talking about, is a major stressor. And we all know that prolonged stress takes a physical toll.
So what does that actually look like in the real world? Well, the analysis points to several serious, though indirect, medical issues. We're talking about an increased risk for cardiovascular problems, a weakened immune system, digestive issues, and even making chronic pain worse. The source also links feelings of impurity or being unclean to problems like sexual dysfunction and disordered eating.
And here's where it becomes a really challenging feedback loop. If someone is already struggling with their mental health, a deep-seated feeling of unworthiness can make it incredibly hard to even think about seeking professional help. They might believe their suffering is just a deserved punishment, which creates this huge barrier to ever getting better.
The analysis doesn't just stop at the personal level, though. It broadens its scope to look at some of the larger philosophical and ethical objections that these potential harms bring up about the entire theological framework itself.
This is a core moral question raised by critics. From a justice standpoint, is it actually fair to hold someone accountable for a sinful nature they were just born with? The objection is really centered on the idea that justice should be about our choices and our actions, not some inherited state of being. And from a mental health perspective, the objection is even more direct. The argument is pretty simple. Any belief system that systematically creates chronic guilt, shame, and fear is, by its very nature, going to be bad for your psychological well-being.
Then there's this philosophical tension. Critics start to question how a system that requires a violent death to pay for a flaw that was supposedly there from the beginning, how does that line up with the concept of an all-powerful, all-loving, and just God? It raises some really deep questions about the nature of divine justice.
And finally, the analysis points to a challenge that comes from just everyday life. A lot of people simply look at the world and see inherent goodness, empathy, and altruism. You see it in kids, you see it in people of all faiths and no faith at all. And this observation of basic human decency seems to directly contradict the idea that everyone is fundamentally sinful.
So, with all these potential harms and objections on the table, where does that leave us? Well, the conclusion isn't a total rejection of these ideas, but it is a very strong call for nuance and for re-examination. Ultimately, the analysis lands right here. It acknowledges that these doctrines are foundational to a major world religion, while also concluding that they carry a real potential for serious psychological and spiritual harm if they aren't handled with immense care and wisdom.
So the path forward, as suggested by this perspective, involves a kind of three-pronged approach. First, moving beyond rigid, literal interpretations toward a more nuanced theology. Second, prioritizing pastoral care that is psychologically informed and really sensitive to mental health. And finally, actively avoiding teachings and phrasing that are known to be psychologically damaging, especially when it comes to children.
And that brings us to our final slide, and it leaves us with a question that extends way beyond this one specific topic. In a world that's becoming more and more aware of psychology, how do we navigate the relationship between ancient traditions and our modern understanding of human well-being? It's a complex conversation, and definitely one worth having.